Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this listening panel. This is the second of two listening panels that are being run under the Path to Excellence 2 programme, which is looking at quality improvements over services. Some of you may be familiar with Path to Excellence 1, which was where services that needed urgent attention were dealt with under a programme back in 2000, from 2017 to 18. This phase is looking particularly at emergency care and acute medicine, emergency surgery and planned operations, planned care and outpatients, and clinical support services. A lot of what people are interested in relate directly to that, but also the things that are linked to those services and the effect those changes to those services might have on them. The purpose of the listening panel is to allow people to come and talk to the panel, who I'm going to get to introduce themselves in just 1 second, about what they think the panel should be and other parties should be taking into consideration in working with these services. It is a dialogue opportunity, and whereas we have people who are coming in to talk to us directly, those of you who are online are more than welcome to send in questions that the panel are happy to answer and actually debate across here if you like to. It is an opportunity as well for the panel themselves to ask people questions who are putting across cases or information that they think should be taken into account. And apologies that we're starting late. Unfortunately, Emma Lawbuck, the Labour MP for South Shields, has been taken ill, and she was going to be our first contributor today, so we are starting later. Let's run through who we've got here today to answer your questions. If I could start over at the right.
Hi, I'm GP Dr. Patterson, and I'm Sunderland CCG Clinical Chair.
Good morning. My name's Jeanette Scott, and I'm Director of Nursing Quality and Safety at South Tyneside CCG.
Good morning. I'm Dr. Shaz Wahid. I'm the Medical Director at South Tyneside and Sunderland NHS Foundation Trust.
Hello, I'm Dr. Matthew Wormsley, GP in South Tyneside and Chair of the CCG in South Tyneside.
Good morning, I'm Deborah Cornell, and I'm Head of Corporate Affairs for Sunderland CCG.
And my name is Nicholas Duffin. I'm an independent chair from the Consultation Institute, here to just make sure that proceedings happen in a fair and constructive and transparent way during the course of today. So I did actually put out a broadcast a little earlier just to ask for people to contribute questions if they had any. There haven't been any forthcoming at the moment, and there may be some that will come in, to my knowledge anyway. So what I'm going to ask is Peter Bauer from Health Watch South Tyneside to come and have a chat, basically, and come and talk to us.
Thank you.
Welcome again, Peter. I mean, we saw you last time, and it's nice to have you back.
Yes. Well, thank you, Nick, and thank you to everybody around the table. I hope as last time you'll bear with me, because I do have I like to say a slight hearing loss, a bit like anybody who can remember Johnny Ray and goes back that far. He used to sing with a hearing aid. So I haven't got one because I'm too ego-bound to get one. So when I can sing like Johnny Ray, I'll get a hearing aid. So if you could bear with me, if you could speak up a little more than you would perhaps normally do so.
Okay, yeah.
That would be helpful. I have to start off with an apology, really, in three ways. One is that I was going through my emails and they'd got rather stacked, and I did this in rather a hurry, so I unfortunately moused the slot. And so I was really coming here today to listen rather than to speak. But being a courageous kind of guy, I guess, and Emma's dispensation, I've come along and I'm filling the slot I unfortunately ticked. The reason for coming along today is that we've got an ICS meeting with Sunderland Health Watch coming up, and they have a new chair, and therefore I wanted to listen from a South Tynes perspective to what Sunderland might have to say. I've got allegiances to Sunderland. I used to worked here for 8 years, so I know it reasonably well. So I'm filling a slot and feel like a bit of a charlatan, but we'll press on from there. I'm also a bit behind the time technologically, because I was talking to Emma again, and she said, well, lots of people be watching and participating on social media, so perhaps I should be somewhere else in space and time altogether rather than in front of you. But here I am. I also have to thank my colleagues in Sunderland for actually being here today and being able to address you at all, because you'll know there's been two consultations recently on P2E that have been carried out with Health Watchers on behalf of NEX. And I've looked at the reports that have been provided by Sunderland Health Watch and the report that we provided. There are two different kinds of reports. One's a report per se from Sunderland. In fact, there are two. There's a 4-page report and a 6-page report. And it's the 6-page report that I want to give credit to Sunderland for, because it's part of my discussion this morning. So I wouldn't discuss that without giving them the credit for the work that they've done. And also our report, which is a different kind of report. It's a feedback report. But again, it has something important in it with respect to the thing that, and Matthew will know this well, Young Health Watch, whereby I mention it perhaps too frequently, but it is a good organisation. It does work well. And I do and would like to see more of the young voice in this process. I have been reassured by members from NEX that the young voice is heard and heard regularly, but I haven't seen it personally, except for the record that's in our feedback report. If I waffle too much, just cut me off, Chair.
Okay.
So the subject I'm going to talk about this morning is risk. Primarily because I read the Sunderland report, and on pages 4 of 5 and 5 of 5, risk is addressed. Now, I've never thought about it overtly before, except probably in the context of your hurdle criteria, where I think risk is addressed in the hurdle criteria, but perhaps not in the further criteria that follow when the hurdle criteria have been successfully jumped. And the reason why I was attracted by risk is that in my, if you call it, third career, I went to work for the probation service. Now, up until then, I'd had a 30-plus year career in NHS. And I cannot remember, and it was a long time ago, so perhaps things have changed markedly, but I can't remember ever explicitly addressing generic or any other kind of risk other than medical, which it was not my job to do, but it was addressed pretty thoroughly. But generic risk, I don't think we did a risk analysis in those days. I've never seen it overtly mentioned in any of the consultations that I've been to, and it is a very important subject, and Sunderland have put it specifically under about 5 or 6 headings in their report. So it made me think about it, because if you look at phase 1, phase 1 was things that really needed to be done, and quickly, and the risk there was far outweighed probably by the benefits if you look at the stroke service, you look at maternity. However, if you look at phase 2 is much more broad, complex. You've got 4 areas with 3 options. Now, that's quite a complex situation. Probably the risk of all of those needs to be addressed. You've got within that, I think, areas that are becoming obviously risk areas. So if you look at the integrated state-of-the-art diagnostic centre that's proposed for South Tyneside, for instance, whether you're a professor of mathematics or you have a GCSE in mathematics, you can see that that's going to take considerable funding. I'm not sure how much funding, but considerable funding. It's obviously out there in the public domain that the usual sources of funding may not be available. So looking at that from a financial risk point of view would be something that one would have to do. Now, I'm sure you might be saying to me, well, Peter, we're doing that. Everybody's working back at the ranch, hard work on risk every day of the week. But that doesn't come through in the consultation process, and I think it should be made more obvious. Sunderland have gone across, I think, 6 or 7 areas of risk. But the other elements of risk that were attracting me were things like greater system risk, for instance, entities that you can't control yourselves but are absolutely essential to enable you to bring this off, who are outside your system, inside the health system. So I'm thinking of the ambulance service here. I'm also thinking of wider systemic risk, health and social care. How much risk analysis is being done, across that boundary. And within the health system itself, how much risk analysis is being doing across these 4 options. Because if you look at the, four areas and 3 options, because if you look at the minimal option, that seems, from a lay perspective and from not addressing it very deeply, a minimal risk option, but has a benefit in staffing, apparently. But if you look at the some change option, the greater change options, for instance, is quite complex. And I would have thought the risk analysis that has to go alongside that would be very important. So what I'm calling for this morning is to make risk analysis as part of the process more overt and perhaps where it's possible to be part of the consultation.
Okay.
As I say, I didn't think of that until I was in the probation service, and then I spent my life every day addressing risk. And the other part of risk that doesn't come through, but perhaps does back at the office, is that when I addressed risk, there was 0 risk and 1 was the maximum risk, as in many mathematical situations. There was a model. It was called, it had an acronym, but we were addressing serious harm. And within that, there were 2 categories of issue. There were dynamic factors, factors which were transitory and lasted a short time. And then there were static factors, which lasted a long time. Now, in health services, things tend to last a long time. So there must be quite a few static factors that you could consider. And if in doing that, you came up with an answer that was greater than 0.4, that meant the person that you were addressing was more than medium risk. And they went off and were seen by somebody who could deal with that kind of situation. So I'm not saying numbers either. Perhaps numbers are inappropriate in this context, I don't know, but it would be nice to say something like a number, come out and say, well, we do it this way, it's 0.8, or it's 80% good, or whatever. So something more concrete. Now, I don't know how the model worked. It's on the net if you want to have a look at it, and it's based on largely subjective judgments, but there are some objectivity in there with respect to probation. So if you are drinking 153 units a week, that's an objective figure. You knew about that. But if you look at the offending history, that's, and the person's personality, that's pretty subjective. But the model worked, and it gave you an answer at the end of the day, and it was said to be an effective way of doing it. So I'm addressing risk to you today, just raising it in the consciousness. How are we addressing it? Can we build it into the consultation process? Can we make it more obvious? The other thing I'd like just to deal with again, which Matthew's heard me before, but when we did our work on feedback, there was a section on young people done by Young Health Watch. And the interesting thing for me there is that the context and the way the answers were made were different to where the context and the answers were made. Perhaps that's not a surprise, but they seem to be more open-minded, more positive, more thinking about the future. So I think engaging the young people, and the drum that I bang frequently is that everybody has a group of young people, more or less, across the borough. The local authority, the trusts, or the trust now, ourselves, other voluntary groups, education. And I still kind of really get my head around why somebody doesn't bring them all together and use that, critical mass as something.
That's the young people across all the different boroughs, effectively.
Just bring them together. We've had a recent question time, which CCG chaired through David Hamilton, which we were very grateful for. It was very well done, and the South Tyneside College for hosting it. And it went very well, and that was directed at young people's mental health. And it was an excellent day. So I think there's a resource there to be tapped, really.
Okay.
And the other thing that comes to mind, and it's just, again, off the top of my head, really, but people who, the protected characteristics that we have these days, some of the protected characteristics are more frequent user of health services, and I don't know how much their involvement is in the consultation process. Not as easy, they're hard to reach groups sometimes, but it was just something that occurred to me. So I apologize that I didn't put in advance a sheet or two of paper. I'm quite happy to do that retrospectively if you would like it. But they're the things that have come across my mind as I addressed the thought of having booked a slot when I probably shouldn't have done.
Okay, no, that's all right. And actually, I think that the things that you've raised are really important things to look at anyway. So regardless of the intent to book the slot or not, it's a good discussion. If we start with the risk element of it, I'm just going to say, I mean, I kind of, as most of the people here know, I work across the UK, basically, not just in health, but in other areas as well. So risk is regularly a topic that has to be looked at. And the panel will actually talk to you in a second about what they do look at. But bearing in mind your experience in looking at risk, as you were pointing out, maybe after the panel have spoken, you might look at it from the perspective of what you think they might want to focus on with regards to risk, based upon what they're doing now, and if there's anything there that you think is something that should be looked at in more depth, perhaps.
Sure.
So what I'll do is I'll just open it up to the panel.
Could I just say, Nick, before you press on, that
Yeah.
due credit has got to be given to Sunderland Health Watch, and I think they have some expertise now as well within their grouping that probably far exceeds mine.
Okay, all right. Then, in which case, then obviously it's something to be looked at afterwards as well. Okay. Does anybody want to talk about the risk, the way in which we approach risk?
I think the risk, the path to excellence is concentrating on is actually the risk to delivering effective patient care. So whatever the clinical teams come together, that's what they are literally looking at. And is the risk around workforce? Is the risk around actually technology? Is the risk around system thinking, like you've said? I think having heard you and reflecting back to the information we prepared for the Phase 1 Path to Excellence consultation, I think what we can probably do and should do is make it more clear as to the risks in each area, what we've done to mitigate those risks, and whether those risks will improve or whether they'll improve modestly, completely, depending on the model chosen.
Sure.
I think a lot of that decision-making which the governing bodies did was based on what's the risk which they want to address in the model. Has it actually made a difference? So I think what I've heard from yourself is what we haven't described eloquently in the consultation is how we're actually going to, what is the risk, what we're going to do, and how we're going to make our decision. That's something we'll take away and reflect on. There were some specific areas of risk you mentioned, so I think that the imaging, I think we've clearly tried to outline that Path to Excellence is a very small jigsaw, and the risk really is around health and social care, prevention you mentioned. Now the reason we've put imaging in there, we know that we're going to have to do more and more tests as our population ages. We know that's a big risk to the system, which is why we put Diagnostic Imaging Centre in. I think it's important I also explain that no decisions have been made where that is going to be, okay, because we need to do a formal risk analysis as part of a formal business case, which is coming through the system, through the trust, and then discussion with our stakeholders. And we want to be in a position that when we go to consultation, we can actually demonstrate the reason why we've picked where to put the Diagnostic Imaging Centre. So in terms of that, I think it's very important. And again, the system risk you mentioned, we're doing a lot of work around prevention, because we know that if we don't get that right, the risks will just get, we might mitigate risk for 5 years, but then they'll rear their heads again 10 years down the line, as an example. So I think we do, as clinicians and as teams, we do a lot of risk analysis. What we're probably not good at, which I think is coming through loud and clear, is actually how to explain that in the consultation process. I think that's what I'm hearing.
I mean, I know that through participating in the Rapid Improvement Workshop that on urgent care, that you have got, and I don't know about Sunderland, and I know there's now one trust, but in the then South Tyneside Trust, you did have a person who was at that urgent care Rapid Improvement Workshop, who is a systems person, who probably is into risk and probably has got the skills and competencies to address it. And the only other thing I would say in terms of the complexity of, 4 areas, which is like, whoa, they're all huge areas and 3 options. How much energy you would have to put into come up with a proper risk analysis is anybody's guess. But reflecting back on my own personal experience, if I was doing an individual with a well-defined system, it would take me 6 hours to do that on one person. So risk analysis is a big issue, especially on something as large as the systems that you're talking about here.
I mean, do you want to give him in? I mean,
I just wanted to ask you, Peter, really, about communicating risk. Now, obviously, Health Watch got a lot of experience of talking with the public, and in your experience, what's the best way for us to be able to talk most effectively to people about risks? I mean, is it sort of putting traffic lights? Is it putting numbers? Have you come across any tools that you would find we think we should use?
I mean, I think you've done it yourself when I've seen you do it at meetings, and that was the demonstration around stroke. I think it's got to be pithy. It's got to be obvious. It probably has got to have some numbers in there, but not a lot. I think back to the transport report and the OCS committee in Sunderland, and my comment that, well, I got the transport report 3 days before I was due to be there, couldn't read it, it's too big, so I just counted up the data items. There were 5,000 data items in there, thereabouts. Don't know how you're going to digest that, so you've got to keep it simple, but it's got to be there. Tangible, believable, simple. There are some people out there you could use to seed the crowd. I would have said, look at our board. We've got 8 people on our board now. One's a numbers guy, but he seeds the rest of us, you know. So you might want to have people who you know are into numbers and who can be used to seed the rest of the people and say, well, and I hate this phrase because it used to be used to me often when I was a junior manager, and what you really meant to say, well, I know what I meant to say, but never mind. But what you really meant to say is this, so what Matthew really meant to say was X, even though it looks like Y. So people who can interpret, perhaps. Also, what I'd err away from is large text documents. I mean, I found this one much better than the first one I read. I know there's a shortened version, and I know there's probably an easy-read version. This is 106 pages. But when we did looking at the options that have been considered so far in the last consultation, I think that was quite a weighty tome. And if you're not taken through it, not led through it, if I can put it that way, but taken through it in a sensitive and sensible way, you wouldn't probably make a lot of headway. So trying to cut the amount of text down, and again, trying to simplify it. But I think I wouldn't worry as much about perhaps numbers as people do sometimes, and that people can see the obvious. And if you said, well, we've done a risk analysis and it says whatever you're going to use the figure for, some people don't like decimals, so you say 80%, we're 80% certain that this is going to be a better way of doing it, then people will either take that on board or not. But at the moment we've got lots of text, which is difficult to distill.
I mean, there's always that balance between what you say and the evidence that supports it.
Yeah, sure.
So, I mean, I don't know, I was going to, immediately made me think that when we're talking about the different risk factors involved in it, there'll be a risk review of different types of things taking place, ranging from staying with the status quo through to the risks that are inherent in actually the options that may be on the table come the consultation time. But one of the problems is actually articulating all the information in a way that's digestible.
Yeah.
But at the same time, for those who want to look at it in more detail, is actually providing them with the information that they can do so in a more scrutinizing kind of a fashion. So, I mean, I don't know if you have any views as to how that might happen. I often refer to it as a kind of an information pyramid, where you keep the most simple things at the top level, but you have levels of complexity behind that aren't necessarily frontline documents.
Sure. Well,
but I don't know what you think on that.
The only view I have is feeding things back in a sort of iterative sense. We did that in the late 80s, early 90s. GPs on your panel. Generic prescribing, when that was a big issue back in those days. We used to feed it back to everybody. We didn't used to put pressure on people to change, as far as I can remember, to change their habits, but you used to feed back to each GP practice and each individual GP what this, and peer group pressure came into it, but it changed behaviour, and I think what you need to do around the table here is bring perception in towards what's actually happening. Because perception is, as we hear quite often, is all there is, but if you can kind of match it up to what's really going to take place, it'd be very useful. And you might be able to do that by making things more tangible.
Okay. And it's interesting what you said about Sunderland as well. So maybe it's an idea to pick the brains of what Sunderland or Health Watch are uncovering or investigating and looking at.
Yeah, I don't want to speak on their behalf, but I don't want not to give them the credit.
Yeah.
It's up to Sunderland what they want to say and do, but I wouldn't steal their work.
Okay.
Sorry, I was just going to make a general point actually in terms of like risk management and how we manage risk within the NHS. Because we do, as NHS organisations, we are required to have a strategy in place, which is what you're talking about, being very tangible, being very visual. It's done on a sort of a matrix with different colour codes, that kind of thing. And I'm wondering if that's something that we should consider. You see, bringing into the document, because if you look at our risk registers, they're most of them are very easy to read because it states what the risk is, what actions you're taking and to mitigate that risk and what you're carrying at the end of it. So I'm wondering if that's something that we could feed into the document to make it a bit more easier and a bit more clear as to what we're carrying.
That sounds very positive. I think the other thing what Nick and I were talking about when we were sitting over there is that I'm obviously a biased person in terms of I like numbers. I've done risk, can see it's an obvious benefit, but perhaps it's push off Peter because the rest of the world don't. So I think you've got to distill from what one's saying, and I'm sure you do, what would be good in general terms and what wouldn't.
Well, it's an extension of the principle that when we go out and make changes to services, is the members of the public who will take part in your consultation and other activities beforehand are generally going to be concerned with how is this going to affect me?
Indeed.
And obviously affect you in a number of different ways, but is that effect one that creates risk for them? Is obviously a legitimate part of that thinking on their part that needs to be satisfied in any answers. Sure. So, and that's at just one end of the spectrum. It's also about the risk looking at, maintaining the services anyway.
Sure.
So there's the change level, but there's also we've got to keep these services actually happening.
Sure. But, I address it as risk because that's what I'm used to doing.
Yeah.
If you like, a professional in the field, certainly in probation. But you may want to flip it on its head and call it benefit.
Yeah.
So, because the word risk to the public is not a good word, probably, but benefit is a good word.
Just out of curiosity, to what extent, you as Health Watch, you engage with the public a lot. What do you think to what level do you think the public have an understanding of things like SWOT analysis? I realise that not everybody will look at that, but to what extent? And the reason I ask that is because obviously that principle of describing things on that basis, as in, the strength of what's being proposed. If we were to think of it in the terms of proposal, strength of it, weaknesses, opportunities it creates, threats or risks.
I would have said low, in general terms, but picking up the social media issue, I don't know how many people out there on social media listening and watching, something you could explain quite easily through social media, and then the level of understanding would take a quantum jump.
Yeah.
Do a webinar, I don't know.
Okay. Anybody else want to contribute anything on risk at this point in time? I was interested in what you were saying about the young people, about bringing them together. If you were to look at it from the perspective of what has happened in recent programs here, and again, in your Health Watch capacity, you will have seen some young people's involvement. Have you got in your eyes, what would be the ways actually to achieve bringing more of young people involved into the programs effectively?
Well, I just have to reiterate what I said before, because engaging with the people within those organisations who have responsibility for looking after their young volunteers. We have a young volunteer coordinator. I'm sure there's somebody in South Tyneside Council and somebody in education. And bring them together, and don't necessarily bring the young people together first. Bring them together. Say, is it a good idea, or is he talking through the back of his head? I don't know whether I am. I'm not. It just seems so obvious to me. But I'm not making a lot of progress, so perhaps it isn't obvious. Or perhaps I'm saying it in the wrong way, or addressing the wrong people. I don't know. But it just seems so obvious to me. And when you hear young people at, say, the question time event we had, it's fresh because the baggage isn't there yet. With people of my age, I can't get through the door for the baggage. So, it's very refreshing.
Yeah.
And I think the only thing you can't do with young people is to let them down. So if you say we're addressing these 31 issues that you brought up about your mental health care, and then we don't progress any of those, that's not good news. So if you involve young people, I think you'd get very short shrift if they gave of their energy and time and nothing came out of it that was a benefit.
I mean, do you think it would be a good idea, and I don't know, this may already be happening, is to have something like a young person's sort of panel, if you like, drawing from those different groups to use as sense checkers in the programs that they're working on?
I think partly because the one thing that you notice is that, and it's probably reflected here as well, the number of people who are prepared to get on their hind legs and speak is minimal. It's a great skill if you can do it well. I mean, I've seen that done well recently again. I mean, we've got a recently appointed chair. I think he's been appointed 18 months now for Northumberland Town and Weir Trust, and they're very lucky to have that person. He gave in 1986, I go back a long way, the most inspiring speech I've ever heard to a group of people who were then called administrators and were then called a year later general managers. He's excellent. So people who have got that skill are as rare as hen's teeth and very valuable. And where I'm coming from is that you'll find amongst the young people, at least we found on the day of the question time, that 1 out of 7 or 8 was prepared to stand up and say anything. If you can imbue that wider basic skill, such a thing you can do for people, you know. How many times have you got to use some kind of negotiating strategy just in, I don't know, getting your washing machine repaired or whatever? These days, it's quite a difficult scenario.
Yeah.
So if you can imbue that wider basic skill across more young people, superb outcome.
Yeah. And views? Just out of curiosity, to what extent do you think that young people did contribute to helping you arrive at the solutions that are currently on the table? I mean, I know there was a lot of engagement work that took place. Do we know what the young people involvement in it was, offhand? Yeah. No, it's interesting, isn't it? It's interesting that we kind of, when we think of it that way, we take all the different pieces of information quite often without thinking about where it has necessarily come from as we pool it to use it. And the thing that I would say is that the whole process that you sometimes see happening behind the scenes is that there are often a lot of people that people don't realise are actually being involved in the process, and they make their contributions, and that information is pooled to inform clinicians and others in modelling and the work that they do. What might be better is to actually start thinking about whether or not we need to articulate who has been involved better in the processes arriving at each stage, or something like that.
I mean,
because
what
that
could
actually
you-
then
yeah.
encourages us to think about, if we've got short representation here, age groups, maybe we need to be doing more to it.
I mean, what could be a reach for the sky and probably is impossible, but if you had a group of random ages, probably most of those random ages wouldn't be random, they'd be on the far side of 45. And you seeded that with young people who were articulate, who were prepared to stand their hind legs and challenge. And they sort of led that group. You might get some interesting outcomes.
Yeah, yeah. And it kind of also fits in with what you were saying, you're drawing attention to protected characteristics as well, and their involvement in it. Just refresh my memory, what was the main point with regards to the protected characteristics?
Well, it's a selfish point, to be honest,
Yeah.
because I've now become one almost. Well, twice, because I'm now 71, so I'm elderly, and I've got a partial hearing problem.
Yeah.
And you don't realise how important those things are until you're there. And the tide comes in on everybody eventually, so we're all going to move into that era. And I just think it is true that, I think it's true factually, perhaps I'm wrong, but I think certain people in protected characteristic categories, I hate to use that term, but it's the way I can put it, are more frequent users of the health service.
Yeah.
They're also, I think, quite difficult to engage with. Certain categories, on the other hand, other categories probably are more frequently engaged with. And I'm thinking physical illness versus mental health.
Yeah.
So I just think it's something that needs to be considered, again, overtly. Are we doing it? Are we doing it right? Are we doing it well? Yes, well, good. Move on. Are we not?
Yeah.
Let's think about it a bit more.
I think that there is this interesting dynamic in that there will be people who cover the different characteristics as such in general engagement, but there's also the duty to ensure that you do equalities analysis in order that the process of change is managed, understanding the needs of people from the different characteristics. So that is actually done. The question is, I always ask the question as to how good we are at doing it, particularly with those who are, as you say, less accessible to us. But I do know from looking at the information in this particular program that it looks like on the surface that there's been pretty good involvement. But again, perhaps it isn't articulated well enough what's taken place.
I just think of, and Matthew will know this better than I do, in that your long-term health strategy, chronic illness strategy, the number of people that have many more chronic conditions now than they did, say, 10, 15 years ago is exponentially different. And the pressures that puts on health and social care. That also comes with like a slightly psychological issue, in that when you get to this age, you go, oh, it's my fault that the health service is going wrong, because I'm not going to the store too frequently. So that needs to be thought about as well.
Yeah. I'd be interested, I don't know about, sorry, hogging the limelight here a bit really, but I'd be interested to know what your thoughts are on, so you take a population like that of Sunderland and South Tyneside, kind of what sort of numbers of people who are labelled as characteristics, and I appreciate we're all actually technically a characteristic based on our sexuality and our age, if nothing else. But what sort of ratios of people would you want involved in the process? So if we take, for example, people from ethnic minorities or people from religious groups and things like that, what do you think looks like a balanced approach to getting them involved in helping to, input for solutions and
I think
testing them?
I think it's an excellent question for which I've got a totally inadequate answer, because I probably don't know. But it does seem to me that wherever there's a group of people, there will be an organisation that is concerned with that group of people's needs. Yeah. And I'm sure you're doing it now, and if you're not, I'd be amazed, going out to those organisations and bringing those people in. That would be the best and most simple way of doing it, I think, but I'm sure you're doing that already. It's just what I'm seeing in the consultation that comes through. I don't see that overtly on the front page of the stuff I read. It might be just I'm looking for a reassurance for the rest of us or whoever, saying, well, these groups have been consulted and the issues that have come out of these are X, Y, and Z. Because, for instance, why I mentioned the imaging centre, that's another selfish thing, because imaging is so tremendously good these days. The diagnostics you can get out of some of the imaging these days are fantastic. If we'd had MRI and CT earlier, perhaps some deep-seated cancers might have been diagnosed better than they were in the time I was looking at it. So, it's just bringing it to the fore, making it obvious. But I haven't got a simple answer to you that you probably haven't already addressed, I wouldn't have thought.
No, but if I'm honest, I think that most people are always questioning themselves on it. Yeah. It's my experience, and I think you guys will probably agree. Debbie,
I think the other thing is the vocal, non-vocal. I'm obviously vocal. Perhaps you want to chuck me out the door. But when you sit in there and you chair a meeting, for instance, it's tantamount, I think, to being a good chairman, to bring everybody in at the end, because it's usually the person who hasn't said anything that's got the vital thing that needs to be brought out. And I don't know how you're tackling vocal versus non-vocal and getting the non-vocal people to express their views.
Which is why I'm going to get Debbie to have the word now.
Sorry. No, it was just, I suppose, again, just another general comment. Underneath all of this, there is a very detailed engagement plan which sets out all the number of different sort of groups that we do go to engage with. I suppose, just to give an example, I can obviously only speak for Sunderland. We have an equality and diversity network, which, although I don't want to say for one moment it covers everything that we need, that we need to cover, but that is a mechanism that we can sort of speak to them and sort of try and get the messages out there and get the views backwards, back to us, to include. So I think really I don't think we've been quite explicit enough possibly with that,
Yeah.
because as I say, there is a lot of work that goes, sits underneath all of this.
Yeah.
So maybe it's about articulating that in a better way, to show sort of, and again, to ask the question, have we thought of everybody? Have we covered everything that we need to cover? So I suppose just for us to take that back and look at that again, but
Sure.
to give you that kind of some assurance that there is a very, very detailed plan underneath this. But again, happy to keep sense checking that to make sure it's, we haven't missed anything.
I think that's an important point about the explicit, non-explicit boundary again, because there's a lot of discussion in these documents about workforce. I don't think there's been enough explicit discussion about workforce. I mean, one of my near neighbours is currently a nurse, and the number of times I see her car going on and off the drive, I'm thinking, how many shifts is this person working? You know, and you read this document, and the amount of money that's implied is going out to agency staff because of the current setup is considerable. So I'm just calling for a bit more upfront stuff. Let's not smooth it over too much. Let's be a bit more explicit. Perhaps that's wrong, and if it's wrong, it's wrong.
It's interesting because with what you talked about earlier about size of documents and complexity of documents, keeping it simple. So so what you're really advocating is simple messages about what's actually been involved and who's been involved, that kind of thing, within there. Yeah.
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 Absolutely.
Okay.
I was just going to mention as well, and where there's been successful engagement with certain groups, such as the young people involved, the listening panel with young people. So where you know that a certain way of engaging has been successful, then you utilise that. And you're right in saying there's already established groups there, so why not use them? So whatever groups that there are. But I think one of the important messages is there's different ways to engage with different groups of people and not one size fits all. So for young people, for instance, we've just had a conversation earlier about how everything's done on the phone with young people. And so written documents and coming to meetings, and the point about who's going to stand up and speak might not be the best way to engage with young people generally, to engage as many young people as possible and get them to share their views, because they probably much more readily share their views over some kind of social media than they would come to sit in a meeting and putting their hand up to offer an opinion or some advice or a suggestion.
Yeah, I mean, what I'm not saying is that, trying to do this process well, you work extremely hard at the consultation process, and it's done exceptionally well, I think, in terms of its peers. It's just a very difficult thing to do.
Yeah, inherently. So yeah. Anybody else got anything else they want to? Anything on the protected characteristics element of it? No. Peter, I guess anything else you wanted to contribute before we?
No, I think you've heard enough from me.
Yeah, no, I think what you've raised is brilliant, Peter, and I think that it is always great to have somebody like yourself come in and provide food for thought and try and be constructive in helping the panel and the bodies consulting think about the things that they might focus on. So thank you very much indeed.
Yeah. And I'll watch what I'm doing next time with the mouse.
Having said that, it was useful information. So yeah, thank you, Peter.
Thank you.
Okay. All right, ladies and gents, we have next on our agenda Sharon Hodgson, the MP, who I'm guessing not here yet, is due in 15 minutes. So what I'm going to suggest is that we could, have we had any questions come in, by the way? No questions coming in. So what we'll do is we'll take a comfort break. Oh, sorry. Oh, okay. So we'll take a quick comfort break now? Yeah, we'll take a quick comfort break and then we'll come back. We have got some questions for you. So 10 minutes? Yep. Okay. Welcome back, everybody, to the listening panel. We're going to resume shortly. Well, we're resuming now. We're going to be hearing from Sharon Hodgson, the Member of Parliament for Washington and Sunderland West, shortly. But before we do, we've got some audience questions. So, Helen, I think you're going to let us have some of those questions, aren't you?
Yeah, so we've got 2 questions from the audience, and then one of the audience participants is going to come up and ask her question as well. So the first one was around what are the benefits, what are the proposed benefits for actually doing this work?
The work as in?
The work as in the proposed solutions.
Okay.
Maybe
Take it, yeah.
Proposed benefits are always going back to delivering better patient care. So I think all 3 options are better than the status quo at the moment. So we know that there's certain things which we're not delivering on in terms of quality. So for example, we do know that there are certain services which are on 7 days, as an example. We do know that you sometimes can't get, let's say, a CT scan as quickly as possible on the weekend as you can on a Wednesday afternoon. We do know there are certain quality standards which we're judged by, for example, how quickly we give antibiotics for sepsis, because of some of the workforce issues we got. We know that we struggle to hit those standards. So every option, which at the moment is being worked through by the clinical team, there's an element of improving patient care. So ultimately, that is the reason the ideas are on the table. I think where we are at the moment is we need to get more, I would say, input, you know, because we've had the specialists look at this, we've had a small clinical team look at this, but we need to get more input from others, hear from others, so we can refine the ideas further so that we make absolutely sure that what we deliver will be better patient care.
I mean, I was going to just add that we had Mr. Green, the orthopaedic consultant, recently advising us basically that exact question. I think I cited exactly the same thing. He gave an example around the theatres and the difference between being able to do acute surgery where there's been an accident or something and routine surgery, and the fact that's very disruptive to theatres, and by doing the separation between that bit of work, it frees up theatre time, it reduces cancellations, reduces infection rates. So it's all back to the quality, accessibility. So things like that, I think, are the advantages to doing this piece of work. And I'm sure that's reciprocated across all the areas, but that was just the one that stuck in my mind to answer the question.
I was going to say exactly the same thing. It's the people will notice, you know, the surgical options are the same thing in each of the three options, and that's, you know, the main area. One of the main areas for improvement there will be this sort of much reduced cancellation rates that we currently see because of trying to have 2 hospitals mixing emergency work and routine elective work, and that, you know, that we want to get things better for the public with less cancellations.
Okay. I think one of the things that people probably don't think about is the fact, or it wouldn't be necessarily part of the public consciousness, is that there is actually a legislative duty for health services to continually review and look to try and improve the services, which is part of the driver for the type of things that are happening all the way across the country at this point in time. So there is that perspective as well.
Thank you. So my second question is, why is it so important to join up as different NHS organisations to work together?
I think it's important we don't work in our silos. So one of the things we try to reiterate in this whole Path to Excellence work is that Path to Excellence is actually a small part of the jigsaw. So again, in the detail, we know that healthcare in the hospital setting only determines 15% of the population health. So we do know that if we don't work with our partners and the commissioners, our GPs, our local authorities, we need to tackle prevention, we need to tackle health and social care. Ultimately, for us to give the best care to our patients isn't necessarily just in the hospital setting. So we do have to work collaboratively as organisations. If you go to the hospital setting, the teams already work collaboratively. So E&D work collaboratively with surgeons, surgeons work collaboratively with the medical teams, and I think at the system level we need to work collaboratively with all of our partners in the system to give the best patient care.
Yeah, I mean, I would just add that, you know, from the patient's perspective, I think they already expect that we work closely together. I think sometimes they're quite shocked to hear where that's not working as well as we would like. So I think it's incumbent on all of us to make sure we deliver what the patients expect, which is that seamless care. We don't always get to do that as well as we'd like. So I think anything that we do to improve that is essentially what we should be doing. It's what's expected.
And if we don't, we could produce a system with gaps, and the trouble with gaps is people fall into them and problems happen then. Yeah.
Okay.
We've just got a question from Liz.
Okay. Now, just for those of you who are watching on camera, this is one of our live audience in the room coming forward.
Right, the first
Hello,
part
Liz.
of my question is a more detailed one on the plans, where you're talking about having one centre of excellence at South Tyneside. Would it not be better to have it as a dual hub centre of excellence, so people don't think that if they have to go to Sunderland for the more complex surgeries, it's not a centre of excellence, but the whole of the surgical aspect should be as a centre of excellence, so calling it a dual hub would avoid any misconceptions.
I think that's a very valid question. It's important that the excellence is across all of our sites. We mustn't forget we also have a Durham Treatment Centre as an
It's
example.
not obvious in the material,
So we
which
do
I
need to
think
look
is
at
something
our
that
wording.
needs to be looked
Yeah.
at. Also, while appreciating that the future of health and social care is somewhat nebulous at the moment, do you not think if you don't ask, well, I know we can't consult on what is unobtainable, but if you don't ask, you don't get. And if we're going to address the health inequalities in this region, because we're still way too low on a lot of measures, would it not be better to try and go for the best possible option? Because the extra cost on top of the basic option, because we don't get the imaging and diagnostic centre, then we're not going to get anywhere. But I think if we, don't you think it'd be better if we actually went and asked for the sky and hopefully we get, you know, the ceiling?
Could you explain that a bit more?
Well, if you don't ask for what you really, really want, sorry to quote last night,
Okay.
you won't get it.
And
So I think you need to go for the best. Why should we be second-class region anymore? If we're going to sort of recruit and retain staff, to give staff the sort of, and to nurture staff, to give them the sort of work experience so they really want to stay here, because happy staff means far more happy patients. So, you know, it's a...
Absolutely right, Liz, and that should be business as usual. We shouldn't do it through Path to Excellence. I think the thing with Path to Excellence, it allows us to transform services so that we can retain staff and attract quality staff to deliver what they want to do, specialist areas, but I think that's business as usual. And I think the problem we have, if you ask for the sky, we know, well, money's not limitless. And also we have a public duty to spend the public purse wisely.
But on the other hand, we shouldn't shortchange ourselves.
Absolutely, but we need to do things effectively.
Yeah.
Comes back to what Matthew said, is that at the moment in the NHS, actually we're doing three things, depending on where the area is, but if you look at it very carefully and transform services, that the patients get the right care right at the beginning, and it prevents the problems downstream.
But I think
that should be business.
actually long-term cost effective, if we can aim for the best possible system, and then we can say, look, in this time, okay, it's not going to happen in 6 months, a year, it may take 5, 10, 15 years for the benefits to come through, but this region deserves it. So that and improved communications with everybody would be a really good start. Thank you.
Oh, Liz, before you go, I was just going to ask a question with regards to trying to, you know, achieve the sky, if you like, so to speak. I mean, you're talking to some extent about trying to get hold of the funds effectively that would actually empower that, isn't it? It's just an observation that I think that might be useful for other people who are listening, is that you are in the situation here, like a lot of other areas of the country, that when it's in comparison with other areas of country, seem to have less effectively. So there's a lot of people in the same situation looking at this in the same way, and it is part of, and I know the previous thing that came up was the discussion about collaborative, and working together. And I think that there's a lot to be said about regions and areas starting to think more constructively about how they support one another and extending that a little bit further and looking at how that might be achieved. Because certainly down in Teesside, they'd be thinking in the same sort of way, as you can probably understand. And Manchester felt the same, which is why Manchester devolved effectively and tried to take control for themselves. I don't know if that's been successful for them or not, but these are all the type of considerations that might be part of the factors that would help.
Yeah, but in some ways we're very lucky that this is quite a compact region, even if you're going even into Northumberland, basically. But people are scared of having to go too far.
Yeah.
So I think, you need to break down little battlements and ivory towers and things and get people communicating more, but they've got to communicate better with the public. Because, even with the urgent care, there's still massive confusion about what people should do, and that is something that ought to have been better. But we're working. I know people are working on it, but you don't want to have the confusion that came out in the first phase. It needs to make sure that we get it right this time, and really get out there. And I think there's a lot of work that could be done with community groups. Commission more and more groups to go out and talk to people, and hold more and more focus groups, as well as even if it's only talking to half a dozen people, that will cascade out eventually. So it's worth a try. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Liz. Okay, thank you very much for the questions, for those Liz, and for other people online who've contributed questions. It's now my pleasure to invite Sharon Hodgson to come and talk to us, if that's all right. And for those who are watching, she's the Member of Parliament for Washington and Sunderland West. So welcome, Sharon.
Thank you.
Thanks very much for coming in.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Nick. And good afternoon, Nelly. Good morning. Early afternoon, everyone. Thank you for giving me a chance to come along and speak to you about these important changes to our local services, our hospitals. As you said, I'm the Member of Parliament for Washington and Sunderland West, but I'm also, in my parliamentary role, Shadow Public Health Minister. So I'm going to speak, I have an interest from both a local and a national perspective. So I agree, I think everyone has to, that, the services do need to change in order to be sustainable and to improve, and I'm sure you would all agree, that should never be at the expense of safety or patient safety or outcomes. And any changes must prioritise patients, their safety, their outcomes and experiences, and must be delivered to the highest possible quality and standards. So, that's a given. That's what we're all agreed upon. I've got sort of 5 key areas as we've worked through the document that I'm sort of going to raise and have sometimes one, sometimes sort of 3, 4 sort of small questions to put to you on each one. Would it be beneficial to sort of deal with each section as we come to it, rather than all the questions all?
Yeah, I think so. That makes sense,
so
it makes it manageable.
So, so the first area is around financial constraints, as I'm calling it. So, obviously, we all recognise, nobody more than yourselves who work in the NHS, the significant financial constraints that NHS is operating under, with the huge, obviously I'm political, the spending cuts that you've all had to endure by the Conservative government. And the document recognises, and it says, and I quote, "Our emergency care and acute medicine services make an annual loss of millions of pounds, and we currently have to spend millions on agency staff in this clinical service area alone." And so I'm very well aware and happy to see it over and over and over again. The NHS workforce do an excellent job under such trying circumstances and increasing pressure and the demand that they're under. But it's because of this growing demand that the government needs to ensure, therefore, that the NHS is sufficiently and sustainably funded. And the government must also, and I know you'll agree with this, invest in training, including, you mightn't agree with this, but I hope some of you do, including reinstating the nursery bursaries so that we have a trained workforce who are supported in their work rather than stretched to breaking point, as lots of them currently are, and not even deciding to enter the profession. I'm well aware of the nursing, the shortages at the moment in recruitment for nursing. So the document states our working ideas contained within this document are therefore made on the assumption that further capital resource will be made available to the local NHS to facilitate transformational service change. But this is my question on this section. What if this is not the case? What we've heard, the Spending Review is now likely to be delayed because of the leadership situation, and our Secretary of State for Health obviously is part of that leadership contest at the moment. So we've heard that, you know, this Spending Review is going to be delayed. So when do you expect these changes to be completed, and what plans are in place if the funding is therefore not forthcoming or is significantly delayed? So that's my question on this section.
Okay. I'm going to invite you guys to...
So there's the capital question, which we've made no bones, but made absolutely clear that as we go through each option, we need to have more capital funding to make the transformational changes. You're right, the initial spending review, we weren't successful through the NHS sources. We're hoping that the second spending review will give us an opportunity to have a look at that again. However, we are exploring other opportunities and other avenues. So, you know, I think several months ago I could have said the very early stage, they've moved on a bit. But what we do know is that we can't go to public consultation unless we've got our regulators' confidence that the capital is there. So at the moment, from the Trust perspective and with the support of our partners, we are exploring options to get the capital together, because we firmly believe these changes are for the benefit of our patients. So we are firmly looking at that.
Anybody else? Is that
Anybody else want to contribute anything? Yeah.
Everything that we need to say, I think. Yeah.
I think it is the case, and it's not dissimilar to other parts of the country. Is that there are across the country, people know that there are improvements that need to be made, but are waiting to see the outcome of what you've actually rightly expressed.
Yeah.
You know.
And at every stage, you're hoping that it will come with some capital funding as well. So.
Yeah. I mean, have you got any ideas as to what they should be thinking about? I mean, bearing that in mind, I mean, you might have some perceptions, some experience, and certainly because of your position, have seen other people working in different ways. Is there anything that you think would be useful for them to think about?
Funding the NHS properly and sustainably.
Yeah.
I mean, they keep saying it's not about money. I disagree. It absolutely is.
Yeah.
You know, you are funded less than you've ever, as much as they'll say about how much extra funding they've put in, when you look over time, and there's been so many economists have done this about the amount of money, amount of extra money being put into the NHS, over the period of time of the austerity, the last 9 years, you've had less than you've ever had before. So sort of getting a little bit more now does not make up for, you know, the deficit that you've endured for the last 8 years. So we'd have to fix that funding. I'm not the I'm not the Chancellor. I can't say the Shadow Chancellor. I'm not the Chancellor or the Shadow Chancellor how much that should be. But I think, you know, to try and make out it's not about the money, I think is one of the biggest sort of mistruths in all of this, and a lot of the decisions that we've seen the trusts having to make across the North East, you know, this one, the CCG campaign that I was involved in, it's all about money at the end of the day, at the start of it. And yes, we all want the services to improve, but a lot of the starting point was that it was because of, you know, trying to make the funding that you've got stretch as far and to make the best you know, the best of it, that you've had to do a lot of this. And great if it ends up with a better service. But I think, you know, the pressure the NHS is working under is just not sustainable. So I think sort of fixing the funding would be first and foremost. And I can't hand on heart guarantee that this government, even under whoever the new leader will be, will do that. And I definitely don't believe Brexit's going to make it any better, nor if Trump is able to get his hands on the NHS, because nobody's told him it was
I think that those news articles this week set a lot of people into a nervous spasm.
Yeah, it's the last thing we need, the last thing you all need, I'm sure.
Yeah. Sorry, Shaz, you were going to say.
And I think, but it is important that we use whatever funding is available wisely. You know, I lived through the stage and the age of where the consultant contract changed enormously. Huge amounts of funding was put in, lots of changes in national service frameworks, etc. If I'm honest, I think we could have used the money better. I think there's lots of initiatives, something called getting it right first time, making sure that we always put the patient in the middle. My own clinical practice, you know, patients come and see me in clinic, actually takes them an hour to get here, then an hour and 15 minutes. We need to start using technology better. Could have done that by a telephone consultation. So I think it's important we keep that real impetus going, that, you know, it's about making sure that our services are fit for purpose for our patients, and we're not in the 80s and 90s anymore. And actually what we shouldn't do is do what's best for the clinician. We should do what's best for the patient. So, and a lot of that is moving clinicians out of the comfort box, myself included. So I think that should be business as usual, but then we need to give our staff the tools to do it. So part of that is funding. You know, we need to, but then it's important that the staff use the tools effectively. And part of that is the training. That part of that is to make sure that there's enough staff, and we don't try to stretch things, you know, over too much of a geographical boundary. And when you're talking geographical boundary, you even think at the hospital level, but they're not stretched within the hospital. So I think there's lots we can do to help our staff to deliver the best care.
Slightly off the immediate question that you posed, but I'm going to mention something as an indirect understanding of different scenarios we're seeing around the country in this respect. And what you're seeing here, obviously, in this area, South Tyneside and Sunderland, is some quite big change trying to be managed at this point in time. And the issue, of course, is the funding. In many parts of the country, and I know this area of the country is also thinking about this, and it's something that might be useful from your perspective, is what we're starting to see is a shift in thinking about, could we actually achieve a different way of making our changes happen? And that is that rather than having to do a lot in quite quickly together, is have a process of gradual change, and influenced by listening to the public on what we call a continuous basis to inform what needs to change effectively. One of the problems I hear a lot from people who work within health is that every time we get a change in government, there's wholesale change to the health service that drives these major change programs rather than the logic of gradual, sensible, logical change. And I think it'd be quite interesting from everybody's perspective, including those who are listening, as to whether, from the Labour perspective, there is any thought on that effectively.
Ideally, we wouldn't have had the Health and Social Care Act. That I think even the Conservative government who's brought it in, whose act it was, are now sort of backing away from some of the elements, the more harmful and destructive, from my point of view, elements of that. They're backing away from that now. I think a lot of them wish that perhaps it hadn't happened. We certainly wish it hadn't happened. And one of the things we've committed to, and this is awful because it sort of reinforces the political change point of view, is to reverse and the Health and Social Care Act, especially the more harmful aspects of it. So I didn't agree with getting rid of PCTs or the Strategic Health Authorities. It's very interesting, some of the reading I did just over the last couple of weeks, is that a sort of a version of Strategic Health Authorities are being used. You've read the same, obviously you'll know more about it than I do, are being reintroduced. And I just read it and I thought, we used to have something like this. It was called a Strategic Health Authority. And so it's just so, I can't imagine how frustrating it is from your point of view, because you are living it day in, day out, and see all of this government sweeping a whole, raft of changes, massive transformational changes, not always for the better, politically motivated. And I agree, it's wrong and we shouldn't do it, but we can't say that we wouldn't come in and also try and put things right as we see it from our point of view, which again will bring about more change. And I suppose the current government would say that their changes were to try and make things better, because I was just going to say our changes would be to try and make things better, and I'm sure that that's what, well, can't be sure that that's what they thought they were going to do, because I ideologically think there was other reasons for the Health and Social Care Act, which was, just mass destruction of the fundamental purpose of our NHS that brought about. So ideally, we should try and get to a stage where there's some consensus that this would stop after we've sorted the NHS out and made it better again.
Okay, that's interesting. Thank you. Yeah, your next theme.
So prevention. Moving on to prevention. So obviously, public health is my shadow brief. I've been doing it now for a couple of years. Bang on about the cuts to the public health budget all the time, but public health spending, as you'll be aware, is a tiny, tiny proportion of the whole national health spending in England. It's just 2.8% in 2018-19, and the figure is sadly falling year on year. And the government want to switch the focus away. Matt Hancock, the Secretary of State, says this all the time, away from cure and onto prevention, but they've made no plans on how they will do this or pay for this. And I welcome the aim to reduce the life expectancy gap, which exists especially for people within our region with the rest of the country, but also within different parts of South Tyneside and Sunderland. You know, depending on where you live, which part of the city you live in, you can have up to 10 years difference in life expectancy. Again, you will see this all firsthand. So, you know, the mission for people to take more responsibility for their own health and their well-being, you know, we can all, myself included, need to be doing better at that. So my 3 quick questions. So how will local NHS services support people to do this when the current provision is actually lacking and underfunded? I mean, this is about trying to work with what you've got and trying to work a bit smarter under these restrained times. What services will be available to people to ensure that everyone has the opportunity to take more responsibility for their own health? And what will happen to those people who, for whatever reason, are just unable to take more responsibility for their own health and well-being?
Can I answer?
Yeah, please do. Yeah.
I'm pretty evangelical about this subject, and actually, I'm evangelical because I think as a system we've put real impetus behind it. So as a system, you know, we've set up a prevention work stream, and that has in-hospital prevention, out-of-hospital prevention, children and young people in it, and it brings all the partners together. So, you know, it's brought, so in our hospital in-hospital prevention group, we've got local authority, commissioners, we've got clinicians around the table, and we're tackling a number of, I think we can't tackle everything, but we're tackling, for example, smoking in all its guises, from in pregnancy. Someone comes into hospital, actually treating their addiction. It's a real mindset change, treating the addiction. We're looking at healthy food strategies. We're looking about what health and well-being is there for our staff. We're breaking the barriers as well. So as an organisation, as an acute trust, we will be hopefully employing, after we've interviewed, a consultant in public health in the acute setting, and that has been paid for by all the partners. So there's a real impetus, and if you talk to people like David Julian, David Chandler, and Peter Sutton, who actually the triumvirate which are leading the prevention work stream, they're looking at things, well, how do we actually improve self-care? How do we, if someone comes and contacts ourselves in any part of the health service, how can we have a measure to decide, well, are they ready to change? Are they ready to go to the next step? But there's lots that can be done, you know, for example, with the councils, you know, about, you know, looking at the you know, the fast food areas, etc., making looking at play spaces, we have more parks, etc., starting with the young. There's lots of work going on, but I think what's important is we're all now sharing it, and we're all saying, right, this is what we have got with. We could do with more money, you know, who couldn't? But actually, as a group, we're now starting to all go together, and the aim is to put prevention on the same sphere as physical ill health at the end of the day.
And I think that where we're at now in this area is actually, it's not the job of the public health team sitting in the council, it's the business as usual for everybody within the NHS in our area. There's a little bit about it in the document, but this is only really scratching the surface of what we're doing, and the management savings. Actually, when we talked as a region, where do we put this £1 million that we've managed to save? Actually, it was, we put it into public health, we put it into prevention.
Excellent. It's good to hear.
I was just going to add to that in terms of, you know, what have we been doing as a system. So we've been working very closely with our local authority public health colleagues, with the trust around all those public health measures. And so something that's been introduced in South Tyneside recently, and I know in Sunderland you've got something similar, is something called a Better You, and that's a coaching service based in GP practices. And so the mantra for that is, instead of taking the medical approach to saying what's the matter with you, that the question is what matters to you. So it takes a completely different approach to addressing somebody's holistic needs instead of just focusing on a condition or an illness or disease or whatever.
Provoke a very different answer,
So,
wouldn't it?
so you do get, and it's seen some really impressive outcomes in terms of being that trigger for people to want to change things in their life, because something that was really important to them, that was causing certain behaviours, has been addressed because of the different conversations have taken place.
Yeah. I mean, one of my points is probably to ask a question back to a politician, to be honest. One of the big determinants, if you have that gap in life expectancy, we know is actually deprivation. And economic well-being of an area. So I suppose one of the concerns we have in the North East is obviously that we don't seem to get the fair share of the slice nationally. So I just wonder how that would be addressed politically, because I don't think it's something that we can address at the table. And also my biggest bugbear, one of the big challenges we've got in public health is things like alcohol. Yet we live in an environment where you can buy a loaf of bread as easily as a bottle of wine. In fact, side by side, teaching our young people that the essentials of life, milk and bread, should be as accessible as alcohol. And I don't see any political move to look at that with your national role. I just wonder whether you could feed to us, you know, where the thinking is on that down in Westminster.
The minimum unit price is something that we are very supportive of. Jonathan Ashworth, as the Shadow Health Secretary, is, you know, very strongly said he would support that, and also he, as the child of an alcoholic, which he's spoken about very, very openly and many times, he understands firsthand the devastation of alcoholism and excess alcohol on a person's life and on the children in that life. And so he does a lot of work campaigning for support for children of alcoholics. So he is very, very mindful of that from his personal background. And also all the work I've equally done looking into this issue and the effects with the liver disease. With the Lancet, I met with the team who are from the Lancet who are looking into alcohol and liver disease. Met with them in Parliament, and to hear the statistics and the age group of, and so I, on the back of that, did a visit to the QE, to the ward with the the liver failure and the effects of that, and the well aware of, it's not people in their 60s or even 50s anymore. Sometimes it's in 20s and 30s. It's, more sort of 40s, 30s downwards and getting younger. And to sort of hear and understand that and the effect that has on the rest of the NHS, but also sort of, this is where the prevention comes in, because when we were in A&E and I was asking about when people come in where alcohol has been a contributing factor to what has brought them in, either the fall or the fight or some other issue, the monitoring of that team, they said they used to be able to do far more with regard to sort of, because there's a test you can do to see if people are in, liver failure. And I said, well, do you not just do that routinely where you think, and they don't. And I thought, well, that just should be the obvious thing you should do. Like, maybe not for every single person, but maybe where you think alcohol has been a contributing factor to the lifestyle issue, if it was a fight or domestic violence or whatever it might be, or somebody's using alcohol to cope with domestic violence issues, and they've come in with pain or something else, but they said no, because what they would then, that test wouldn't mean anything if they're not able to then follow up with the intervention, and they can't. So by the time they are able to sort of intervenes when somebody comes in with the liver failure, that then they start them on that road, when really 10 years earlier they might have come in with maybe a fight or a fall or something else, or have seen their GP with something else, and that's when that work should have started. But it's all the...
I mean, I think the clinician in me, Sharon, when you're down there in Westminster, you know, if you look what we do with cigarettes, we know the harm cigarettes do, and the way we treat cigarettes and market cigarettes and regulate cigarettes. We don't do the same with alcohol. You know, is there an appetite in Westminster to bring similar legislation, not just minimum pricing, but availability, where it's placed in stores. You know, these are the sorts of things that, from a prevention angle,
if you could be doing more and more.
You know, whole city impacts, whole country impacts, it needs to come through that route.
You're right, it doesn't have the same taboo at all as smoking does, and you know, I've heard people say, you know, if it was being come before sort of the powers that be to say whether something can be legal or not in this day and age, would alcohol even be considered to be, you know, something that can just be bought by anyone freely over the age of 18, because of the harmful effects, you know, the same with tobacco. You know, we just sort of, because they're for sale, and we now try to regulate and you know, put out all the public health messaging, but, you know, they probably, you know, there's some people on the pro-drug, you know, legalise and sort of some drug side of things say that actually smoking and alcohol can do more harm, you know, don't necessarily agree with that, but, you know, the costs to the NHS, I know when I've looked at the costs to the NHS of alcohol harm, you know, smoking, tobacco harm, and then when you do it for drug harm, the figures, they're equal, almost as big as each other. When you add the three together, I remember doing that. We did that, added the three together, and I was thinking, wow, the cost to the NHS if you know, the harm from those three things.
It's actually massive. The cost to society as well. Because you can talk about it in financial terms, but these are people's lives being impacted, extended families, people losing the jobs, the employment, the futures, everything, sometimes becoming homeless. So there's a huge societal impact of people becoming reliant, addicted to any sort of substance, and alcohol is freely available and is very addictive. So I support my colleague around that. You know, so
I think probably in time we will. I mean, we've moved on to sugar now. We've got the sugar tax. We've got, you know, sugar is now deemed as, you know, in dietary terms is the enemy, even more than fat. It was always fat and sugar was fine, but now we've moved on. I think in time, you know, we will. We need that. I believe you know, the legislation behind that and regulations to encourage that in the same way. And, you know, we'll get accused of nanny statism and sort of taking away people's, you know, freedoms and liberties to make their own decisions. But I think because of the costs that are so great, you know, I think that we will, because when you've got people in their 20s and 30s and liver wards dying from liver failure, you know, something is going seriously wrong.
I mean, I know I've got to move on, Sharon, but, you know, obviously working clinically, I have a patient who is alcoholic, who's reformed, who cannot go into a local supermarket without first being hit with 3 for 20 quid or whatever it is, you know, with their addiction. You know, if that was in a corner somewhere separate, like cigarettes is, they could buy that loaf of bread without going past the demon. And I think it, you know, we need some legislation. You know, if we're really serious about public health in this country, we need to do some serious decisions, not to prohibit, not to stop people making that choice, but not to send the message that this is normalised, that it's normal to drink alcohol. Alcohol is a poison, and in excess it causes harm. And unfortunately, there's a lot of people who can't control their alcohol intake, and we need to help those as society to do that. And, you know, we really need legislative help to do that. But I know we've got to move on. You've got other questions.
Yeah, no, but that's, it's really thought-provoking.
I couldn't take the chance as a clinician not to say that.
No, I will. And I'll discuss it with John around sort of thinking for, you know, a future Labour government, if that was sort of an avenue we would start to go down. Because you're right, you walk into the supermarket and, you know, you've got the 3 for 2 on the big bags of crisps, the 3 for 2 on the wine, the 3 for 2 on the chocolate. And, you know, so for people who, for, you know, their weight is an issue, you know, it's not 3 for 2 on the apples that greets you. It's, you know, so there is issues there that we can deal with through regulation. We won't be popular though, but you know, we're not anyway at the moment. Politicians don't do anything at the minute to be popular. That's just impossible.
There's nobody who's outright popular at all at the moment, is there? So, you know.
So before we move on, can I just I just wanted to sort of, I suppose, echo a lot of the comments that my colleagues have made, but from a Sunderland perspective, in terms of our sort of commitment to prevention, we know we've got a sort of a real issue about smoking in pregnancy, for example. So we're working very closely with the local authority in terms of the midwife teams to help support that. So I suppose really just to sort of say from a Sunderland perspective, we're absolutely sort of, we get it and say we know there's issues and we are putting things in place there to try and sort of, you know, get as much prevention out there as possible.
That's great to hear, because it's gone up for the first time ever, which you'll be aware.
Absolutely.
That the number of expecting mothers smoking,
it's a real issue. And I think the issue is not always when they come in, when they're pregnant. It starts sort of a lot earlier than that. So we're trying to sort of, you know, do the whole kind of pathway rather than it just be when they are pregnant, trying to tackle it beforehand as well.
And the deprivation point as well, I took part in a debate. That's a massive point that leads to the health inequalities. And so I took part in a debate on the economic strategy, regional economic strategy as part of it, you know, looking at this issue, and I made that point from a public health point of view, that if we're ever going to reduce the health inequalities, then people have got to be able to afford that better food and not always looking for the bargains with the cheaper food, because the cheaper food often is, you know, the most unhealthy, most unhealthy food. And also around, you know, he mentioned around takeaways with local government, the number of takeaways that you have in more deprived areas compared to, you know, if you just got to go to sort of the nicer parts of Sunderland and South Tyneside, there will not be as many takeaways as there is in, say, you know, some of the more deprived parts of my constituency. You could just count them, and you can just, if you didn't know anything else about the area, you would know by the number of takeaways what sort of area you were in, and that's not sort of right.
And the
so
life expectancy that's published in the documents is a general life expectancy. If you actually look at the poorest constituents compared to the best well-off constituents, even in the city of Sunderland, I'm sure the same will be in South Tyneside, actually it's much larger, up to 11 or 12 years difference in life expectancy if you live, well, for instance, where we are now, as compared if you live, dare I say it, in Washington, which has, you know, some more affluent areas. So, you know, there's deprivation within those figures that isn't visible. So, and that is directly linked to economic and all those factors that we've talked about. So, I know we've got other things, but absolutely we'll take the opportunity, given your role, to pick those up with you.
No, definitely, it's been valuable. Moving on to sort of more the local level stuff rather than national sort of overarching themes. So, third area is travel and transport. So, under the proposals, it said that the majority of planned operations will take place in a new centre of surgical excellence in South Tyneside, with emergency, high risk or complex operations taking place in Sunderland. So my questions would be around, you know, travelling to South Tyneside could be distressing for patients from some parts of my constituency and in other parts of Sunderland, when they would, you know, rather obviously be closer to home, and it could make pre and post-op recovery difficult, and that would go for family and friends visiting when they're actually inpatients also. So my question is, will patients have an option to have their surgery in either of the hospitals, or will the type of surgery or what they need determine where they have to go?
So, again, looking at trauma and orthopedics, what they've made absolutely clear is the patient will go where the expertise is. So, as we've already reiterated, the complex and emergency surgery at Sunderland, but if someone needs, let's say, a hip operation, it's not an emergency, it has to be done electively, we know that if we concentrate that at South Tyneside, they'll get the assessment earlier, they'll get the operation earlier, and actually the chances of complications are reduced. They'll not get the operation cancelled. So from that aspect, we will try and concentrate the majority of our elective work in South Tyneside. However, there will be on occasions where some of that can be done in Sunderland. So, for example, if we need to sometimes fill our lists in Sunderland to be more effective, so some of the cases will be done in Sunderland. So we're not saying all cases will be done in South Tyneside, so we do need to balance that. In terms of the pre-op pathways, I think it's important to make the point that that will be done locally. So a lot of the pre-op care, in terms of the assessments and outpatients, etc., will be done locally in the Durham Treatment Centre, Sunderland Royal, South Tyneside. It's the operation And a lot of the post-op care is now actually people get out on the same day, and we've got much more better systems in terms of we necessarily don't bring people back post-operatively. It's about making sure that they get the operation on the day more effectively.
Very good. I've got a few more questions around transport. The document says that looking at new publicity and information summarising bus and metro links that will serve each hospital site, including walking routes into sites and increasing the visibility of public transport stops. So obviously these need to be accessible and affordable to all patients and their friends and family who may be visiting. So, but there's also arguments around hospital car parking charges, and the cost of this is national campaigns on this all the time. So will any provisions be made to lower the cost of hospital parking, especially for patients and maybe key visitors? Will patients who usually go to Sunderland Hospital be reimbursed if they have to travel to South Tyneside Hospital? Could this be looked at perhaps for the poorest patients, even if it has to be means tested for those on low incomes? And lastly, the document mentions ambulance service capacity for transferring emergency patients as something that will need to be very carefully thought about. The North East Ambulance Service Trust continues to be fully and actively engaged in discussion during phase 2. So that I led a debate on the North East Ambulance Service and its capacity issues, and again made it not as a criticism of the service but of the funding that and the constraints the government had put the ambulance service in. But about a dozen MPs from across the region took part, all with sort of horror stories of people lying at the bottom of the stairs or on the street for up to 10 hours or more waiting for an ambulance because they weren't bleeding to death and they were breathing, the two things that, and so they just kept getting pushed down the list. So the question is, because of that, how do you envisage the ambulance service being able to cope? Are you confident that the ambulance service has got the capacity to deal with transferring people between the hospitals if that's necessary?
I'll start with the ambulance question. I think North East Ambulance Service are heavily involved with ourselves in whatever modelling we do. And I think one of the other important points to make here is that we are looking to transfer as much care as possible back to South Tyneside. So if you look at the patients with eye conditions who need to go from South Tyneside to Sunderland, it's a very vulnerable group, and that takes a lot of transport. So these aren't emergency patients, but that takes a lot of resource for the North East Ambulance Service. So if that resource is less, because they're not having to transport them to Sunderland, but more locally, that actually then releases more resource to make sure that they can hit their access standards for the emergencies. It's not easy, we absolutely get that. But again, the more what we call hot and cold site working, so we know that as we go through our models, from minimal up to fuller consolidation, that actually would mean that if the ambulance is picking someone up in an emergency, they would be able to actually go to the emergency centre instead of 2 journeys, for example, occasionally they'll go straight to the emergency centre as an example. So there are benefits, but also I know the North East Ambulance Service are looking at service improvements. So when the ambulance goes to pick up a patient, there's something called Pathfinder that they actually can say, hold on, this individual doesn't need to go to hospital. What access have they got for services that keep them at home, or take them to another service area which isn't necessarily an emergency? And sometimes they can deliver treatment when they go to pick them up, and then take to a less emergency area. So there's lots of work we're doing with North East Ambulance Service to actually help make sure that we're more efficient in that area. But we do understand the pressures they're under, but they are working with ourselves.
Can I add that we're not going to do anything that would be unsafe from an ambulance point of view, that we're working really close, and they're absolutely embedded in the teams looking at the detail. But can I ask you, you mentioned the other side of your question was car parking. Yeah. Are you aware from your work nationally whether there is any areas that have cracked this means testing of car parking on hospital premises? Is there any good models that we can pinch and use. Anyone's got it.
I'm sure there will be. I'm sure there will be, because you never. But the trouble is, you know, MP stands up usually and sort of
Says it's working.
says, "Oh, it's absolutely great." You do in sort of you know, tea room conversations.
I
Or
don't
say,
don't think we've found it from
Right.
discussions with colleagues yet.
There's
So
normally
if
it's
you're
an MP
aware of any, please
let
us
you know. I will, because there's normally MP standing up and sort of, you know, bemoaning their, you know, the terrible atrocity that they've come across from, you know, a local example, rather than somebody standing up and saying, but actually it's wonderful. I know there are some where they've probably not city centre ones, where they've managed to, you know, abolish the car parking charges. But when you've got a city centre hospital, you know, Sunderland, Royal, of, you know, the Newcastle hospitals, where, you know, parking is going to be attractive for people who work there, how else can you do it? There has to be some sort of mechanism for, and also you can't, I can see why it would be difficult to make it free for just anyone. You've got to prioritise the patients and the visitors. I would always also include in that the staff. I hear about the amount of staff sometimes who work in city centre hospitals and how much they are having to pay to park their car. And, you know, I don't think anybody who works for the NHS, apart from, like, you know, the really high ones who are paid really well, probably should be paying, you know, to park, to go to work. And, you know, for city centre hospitals as well, you probably can't afford to live close to the hospital, so you'll need the car to get you to and from your place of work, and then you're having to pay, you know, 10 or 15, 20 pounds a day to park. So it would be interesting. I mean, I could sort of, it could be something that I can get my team to look into, because I'm sure there might be some areas, and then I would certainly share it with you if we find some examples of best practice.
I think it'd be worth it, because it sometimes takes somebody from the outside to look at and find something a little different to suggest it back in. Can make a big difference to what you actually arrive at in solutions anyway.
And I think everyone talks about car parking, the actual act of car parking, but it's important we do have a sustainable environment. So, you know, we have got a hopper bus between South Tyneside and Sunderland, which is being used a lot by our staff. Right. So that reduces car journeys. Yeah. We need to think of park and ride schemes as well. So staff don't necessarily have to park on site, you can do car share. We're even looking at bike schemes. So making sure there's facilities for staff to change on site who want to bike in. So I think we are looking at a range of things. So, you know, the car parking is not necessarily to increase access. I think it's very important we do look at the environment. And say, actually, well, how do we actually minimise car parking and look at other schemes to do that?
And I suppose that's the question around the bus, you know, the access to bus, and I'm constantly campaigning for expansion of the metro to Washington, which, you know, again would help with accessibility, I suppose, into areas of the northeast where there is a metro that might be near a hospital. I don't think in South Tyneside you have a metro near you. Hospital.
Tynedock.
Tynedock is it's not too far away.
It's a 15-minute walk or something. 10-15 minutes.
So then, if the more access people have to the metro, then it does help, you know, at the other end as well, rather than having to get a bus and then a metro. And, you know, that should be the more sustainable direction that we want to move in. But the last point I would just make on parking as well is because we are aware that some trusts, because of under financial constraints, have seen parking as a way to make some money, and it might bring in £500,000 a year or however much, which can be valuable money. And so that aspect of it, sadly, is what brings all the bad headlines, where, you know, the feel has been done for the wrong reasons, not to necessarily just control a limited number of car parking spaces in a very sought after central location where the hospital might be, but it's more about, you know, trying to make money on the back of, you know, sick people and their relatives. So to ensure, it should be about using those spaces. It should only ever be about using those spaces the most equitably and fairly, rather than it being ever any aspect of income generator. So I think that's, you know, but I will look at best practice of where places have managed to crack this and make it fair, and see how you know, and I'll let you know. It'd be a very interesting exercise to do. The last, not second, but like the very quick one, again around accessibility. To to all patients and visitors with regard to parking spaces, ramps, distance from home. It's probably just rhetorical. I'm sure that in all of these changes here, taken into account to make everything as accessible with regard to disabilities and access as possible. It probably just goes without saying, so I thought that would be very quick. Last point, workforce. Document says we'd like to develop a new state-of-the-art integrated diagnostic and imaging centre at South Tyneside District Hospital to serve both local populations. So that sounds great. So, workforce. Will staff be sufficiently trained to operate this new centre? Sounds very high-tech. When will they be trained by? Will they continue to receive training throughout their time working at the centre? That brings us on to the workforce crisis nationally. How does the local NHS plan to train and retain the workforce? How does the local NHS plan to fill current vacancies? How much is currently being spent on agency staff, if anyone is aware of that? How many vacancies do you have? Locally, I know we've got the 40,000 nationally for nurses, 100,000 in total. And how much would be spent if vacancies were being filled?
Right. Before we start it,
That's all on workforce.
before we start answering, just want to point out that we're supposed to finish at 12:30. We've only got the facility till 12:45, so it might be a conversation we need to extend further outside because there's got a lot in that, obviously.
Yes.
But in the meantime, just invite you to initially
need
answer.
to reply in writing to a lot of that for the
Yeah.
Can you give some quick sound bites? Yeah. So I think it's important to make the point that the Diagnostic Imaging Centre, no decision has been made where that's going to be based yet.
Ah, right.
So we need to just, reiterate that point. There's a process we're going through.
So it's not necessarily going to be at South Tyneside.
It's about equipment, so it's having more MRIs, more CTs, and actually they're going to be focused on people who aren't emergencies. So again, the split. So it actually means we can use our workforce who are already trained in a lot of this equipment to actually be more, you can localise them more, so it's be more efficient from that aspect. And that feeds onto the whole aspect of Path to Excellence, is to try to make sure our staff's working life balance is appropriate, so they go into bigger teams. So if you have a bigger team, you're not on call as often, you have a better work-life balance, you can do more of your specialist stuff as well as doing your bread and butter. So it's about making things attractive. We do know we've already done that in a number of specialties. We've attracted people who might not necessarily have attracted. I think one thing which we haven't just mentioned is the aspect of the Sunderland University. We've had a really well-functioning nursing school, which we will continue to liaise with, try and get more staff in, and also not necessarily nursing, so allied health professionals, but also with the medical school opening up as well. There's all sorts of opportunities where we can grow our workforce from the beginning.
So what are the vacancies locally?
Off the top of my head, it was something we would have to go and get an accurate answer for.
But
yourself.
you
We
do
it.
carry
It's reported regularly
Yeah.
through the quality review group, so it's monitored and reported on a
Because I know
regular
the
basis.
you were quite successful. I was reading in the paper as well on the GP recruitment with the incentives that you managed to increase by 30.
We have to work harder to get people to come here. That's why the medical school is such a great thing. It's going to have a focus on general practice in particular, but we have to work harder to get and retain all clinical staff and social care staff as well. It goes much wider to our area, but particularly if you look at the clinical staff, there's many areas, and of course that's some of the driver for some of the changes that we're having to make, is to recruit staff and retain them in a very competitive environment. It's not just competitive nationally, it's actually internationally. So as you'll be aware, in Washington we lost 4 GPs who emigrated to Canada this year. So we're not just dealing with people coming in, we're dealing with people going out, not nationally but internationally as well. So it's a very competitive and complex environment.
Famously, the chair of the Health Select Committee, Sarah Wollaston, her daughter trained to be I think a hospital doctor or GP, and emigrated to Australia. So, you sort of think, if even her daughter is tempted to go elsewhere.
Does it make you wonder if Trump's interest in the NHS is just to nick the staff. One hopes not.
Definitely. So yeah, so anything you weren't able to, if you think that it would be useful to let me know, because it's really useful from a, you know, a local and national perspective to sort of have a, because I know what sort of the national figures are, but it would be really useful to know what the local ones are as well.
Just out of curiosity, I mean, within the people that you talk to in Parliament and things, is there any kind of thoughts on national incentives to try and retain people? Because we're bringing a lot of people in from other countries to supplement, but we're losing just as many people out of the system to other places.
The thing that's been talked about the last few weeks is around, and I'm not on top of all the detail of it, is around the pension scheme and these high tax bills that so many health professionals, is it mainly doctors or not just doctors? Yeah, mainly doctors. So, you know, that whatever issue is happening there, whatever that has got to be sorted out, because it just, you know, seems ludicrous that for some reason they're all getting hit with these huge tax bills. I mean, that cannot be an incentive to keep people in the NHS when, for whatever reason, they're getting hit. Are they getting hit with these tax bills before they've retired or when they've retired?
Yeah, so it's before and after. It's depending on how they manage it. And I think the issue we're having with that, and doctors in the main are well paid, you know, so we're not making an excuse for that, but the incentive of it is that there's no incentive for them to do the extra. And at the time when you've got a workforce shortage, you're relying on doctors doing the extra.
Yeah, so that's where the tax bill comes in.
If they're getting taxed and pensioned up to the hilt, the incentive to do the extra isn't there.
And when there's a shortage.
I don't think many of us would do that, you know, given, you know, that we're already stressed and busy jobs. So I think a solution to that would help the workforce crisis nationally and might help retain internationally, because of course that's one of the factors, like I said earlier, people will vote with their feet, not just nationally but internationally as well. So we need them for the overtime and we need them for the national retention. So hopefully there will be a solution to that, as a complicated problem as it is.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, it's just when you hear things like that, you just think, you know, it's not going to help with the retention or attracting people into the profession when they hear, you know, they hear stuff like that. So yeah, I'm sure there is a lot more that can be done, but I'm sure the NHS workforce people will be looking at
I think from the sound of the conversation that you've had, I'm talking as a neutral here, conversation between you today, it's quite obvious that there's a relationship there to be had in talking a bit further and in more depth with you and the clinicians and the people from the local NHS about the issues, in order that you can work out both local solutions but also thinking about, you know, what might be brought to bear centrally effectively.
Yeah.
You know.
Absolutely. I found it very useful. Thank you very much for your time and patience. It's been a very productive conversation, and good luck with the rest of the consultation.
And thank you for coming in, Sharon. Thank you very much. Thank you, everybody. We have overshot our time, so apologies for that. I'd like to thank everybody who's participated. If you have sent in questions online that we haven't had an opportunity to answer, we will get back to you in some sort of written format. And again, thank everybody for participation today, and it carries on. Thank you.
Thank you very much.